Shane White, and this is The Process. Hey gang, Shane Patrick White here with another edition of The Process. On today's process, I'm going to show you how I transfer a drawing. Now, you see here, I have a illustration value study that I started. I'm in the middle of creating a Magic the Gathering portfolio. So I did this value study on a different sheet of paper, and I scanned it in and printed it out in black and white. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm basically scoring off and finding the center of the drawing. And I'm just using the four corners as a starting point, and then I'm breaking that down. So if you go corner to corner, eventually you will get the center. And then from there, I can use a straight edge or T-square to keep breaking those down into smaller and smaller elements. Now, because the illustration board is the same aspect ratio as the drawing, I do the exact same thing for the illustration board. I find the corners, I find the center, and then I break those down into equal parts. I also, on this piece, I number the quadrants just so I have a reference point to keep track of where I'm at any given moment in time. In older methods, there used to be a grid system that people would use. They'd measure it off inch by inch, both horizontally and vertically, but I find that to be a lot more tedious than it needs to be for my purposes. Once I have the grid finished, I start by comparing the shapes within each part of the grid on the value study. And since I didn't want to draw on the original value study, that's why I printed it out in black and white. By breaking the smaller shapes into triangles and squares, respectively, I can better measure and distill down what those shapes need to be and where they need to go. It's a little bit like paint by numbers, if you're familiar with that. Now you can see here I have this antiquated object called a pencil sharpener. It's something I picked up, well actually my parents got it for me when I was 13. It was one of the first pencil sharpeners I think I had all to myself. And it's one of those that you can fit any size pencil in because you just squeeze the two platens on the top of the thing and just about any pencil goes inside. Funny story about the pencil sharpener. I was in an airport years ago, heading back east to do some drawing and painting, and the TSA agent pulled me aside, had a look in my bag, pulled out the pencil sharpener, and asked me what it was. She wasn't sure if it was dangerous or not. I just told her that it was a pencil sharpener, and she was amazed. She had never seen anything like that. I'm sure it wasn't the weirdest thing she's pulled out of people's luggage. Now, as I go through here, I'm painfully aware that I want to keep the integrity of the original drawing, and that's always the toughest part about transferring any drawing. So whether you're going from a thumbnail to a rough to a finished pencil value study, the integrity is something that we fight to maintain throughout. And the reason why we fight to maintain this, or should, it's a battle worth fighting, is that it's what compelled us to want to do the image in the first place. If we lose that along the way, then we know that any execution or finish of that image is always going to be in the shadows of what it could have been. So you may notice that I'll draw and redraw over and over to get just the right shape, just the right position of the elements on the final illustration board. For instance, horses, of all things, are something that I've been working on for the past year and a half. I've had a graphic novel that I was sort of training myself to illustrate, and the reason why is because there's a lot of horses and a lot of battles. And so it's important that I get the horse at least in the ballpark of where I want it to be. For now, I've got it roughed in. It's in the space that it needs to be, and from there, after this blue pencil, I will go back in and refine it further. This piece, I think I wanted to draw a stone giant or something large like that. And honestly, I've never played Magic the Gathering. I've tried, I think, to get my head wrapped around what it means to play Magic the Gathering. And there are legions of people, my friends included, who love this game and have tried to get me to join them. But I don't know. It feels like a Ponzi scheme. No, it's one of those things that it's like the entry into it seems to be very expensive. And it seems like there's a lot of cards you need to acquire to get good. You see here that I'm actually breaking up the value study a little more. So I'm adding more squares and dividing it even further because I have more detail to consider. Now, I wouldn't do that for areas that have big expanses of rock. There's no need to. It's a waste of time. But in this instance, I've got a lot of figures that are being crushed in the hand of the giant. So it's important that I get their positions right. There's a certain economy to doing it this way. If you're out in the field, for instance, and you need to transfer something, but you don't have a ruler, you don't have a way to measure things out, as long as you have a straight edge that's long enough, you can pretty much transfer any drawing at any time, anywhere. The idea behind the stone giant was that I wanted him to feel like he's being invaded upon in his waterfall retreat spa kind of thing, and I wanted to have him crushing all these warriors, or I don't know what you'd call them. Part of me thinks it would be like hitmen, but I guess if they thought they could get some kind of treasure or something, that they'd be deserving of the risk that they would entail in invading his domain. I like the idea of having one lone guy on a horse to sort of bear witness to this horror that's happening. But now thinking of it, I realize, why is there only one guy on a horse? Where are all the other horses? So I might have made a mistake here. But in the end, it's about the giant. So let's focus on the giant, people. I don't want to have to explain everything here, though I should. That's the one thing about illustration, is you want to account for stupid things that get by you. And if you don't, someone else will spot it and then you'll feel really stupid. So try to bulletproof your concepts before they get to this stage. Now, up until this point, I've done what I would call 3 magic cards. And out of the 3, I think 2 of them, I think they're okay. And those were done digitally. This third one, I'm going to paint in oil. I kind of want to get away from digital a little bit and see if I can take an illustration like this to another level. I have the first 2 illustrations that I did also transferred onto illustration board that I'm going to try and paint. But unfortunately, if I remember correctly, they're about 2/3 smaller than this, or no, they're 1/3 smaller than this piece. So the brush work is going to have to be very controlled. I'm going to have to use smaller brushes, and I don't want to. I like using a lot of paint when I paint. So it'll be a challenge because I'll have to alter my painting to accommodate the scale of the image. Now, like always, I take off the blue pencil with a kneaded eraser to just eliminate some of that rich blue because it's not necessary. It's just a guide, because now I'm going back in and I'm reinforcing the shapes. I'm trying to get the liveliness back from the original drawing into this final image. See, with drawing, you're creating a scaffolding for the paint to hang onto. If the scaffolding is faulty, then it doesn't matter how polished and how beautiful you paint it. It's going to look dreadful. Well, maybe not dreadful, but it'll miss the intent that you originally had when you first fell in love with the thumbnail. Now right here I'm using a really fat pencil. It's actually a grade school pencil. I got turned on to these a couple of years ago and I really like them because they feel better in my hand. I don't know if I have large hands, but I just feel good. It's a nice change of pace when you're trying to pencil something. It's like the texture of the illustration board is such that it's very rough, and this pencil seems to be equal to that scale, if that makes sense. What's nice is my pencil sharpener actually can sharpen this rather easily. It's never at a loss to have a sharp point. Now you see I switched over to a Dixon Ticonderoga number 2. I'm nerding out on pencils because the detail's getting smaller. I want to be able to match the scale of the pencil to what I'm illustrating. So if I want to get in there and get some nice detail, I have to make those kinds of adjustments. So keep that in mind when you're illustrating your own work. There's no rule to say that you have to use the same tool or the same pencil throughout the entire piece. You use the tool that is necessary to get the work down, and whatever tool that is the right tool for you. I like having little stories within the overall story of an illustration. For instance, this guy feels like he's escaped the fate of his colleagues, and yet he's dropped his weapon, his only link to survival. But he's also falling about 35 feet to his death, so I like the distraught feeling of not having your weapon in hand and that your lifeline is snapping before your eyes. That kind of dire feeling I think it makes the image more interesting for people who want to sit and look at it and examine all the pieces. Now for the giant, I actually took some time and concepted him out, because if I don't know what he looks like in the moment, then I can only inform that moment with more detail. And even though some of that detail may be hidden in shadow, I still need to account for it somewhere. And so taking the time, and a little bit of time actually, and just concepting out what he looks like, being a giant, there are limitations. One of those limitations is finding proper clothing in your size. So I had ideas of a sort of a skirt made of stripped bark, a belt made of, it's almost like taking like shipping rope, like ropes that they use for ships, and then braiding that into a belt, but then having that belt have a lot of shields on it, suggesting that, these are all the human warriors that he's killed in his existence. Kind of like a scalp or something, horrible like that, to show how badass you are. I also wanted to make sure that there was something about the stone giant that was peculiar. Like he has these crustaceans or this skin that's disease-ridden, and because of his size, he's gonna get things like fungal infections and things that sort of don't really. It's like what I don't know. Like, is he gonna go to a giant doctor? Or there's what ointments in what quantities would take care of this. So he's kind of at the mercy of his anatomy, and so that entails that he's actually got one eye that is missing, or it's so infected that it's sort of folded in on itself, and it's those little things that it all adds up to make a very compelling picture. So keep that in mind when you're designing your own illustrations. Honest, I don't even remember how I came up with this way of breaking up an image to transfer it. I had used the grid method for a number of years, but then I abandoned it just to sort of eyeball the image, and it kept falling apart. It didn't work well, and I got frustrated. So I think out of necessity and maybe even a little bit of laziness, I decided, well, what if I just did this? What if I just broke it up and, you find the center and you keep finding the center of the squares and break those up into smaller squares? Everything should work out, right? And it did. I mean, the few pieces that I started doing it on, I was like, oh, yeah, this is adequate. I can make adjustments. The whole thing is you're just trying to get the biggest shapes onto the substrate. And then from there, it's just like, oh, okay, now these are just guides to really make that image sing. When I first started freelancing back in the mid-90s, I think one of the first jobs I did was for TSR's Dungeons & Dragons on a product called Hellgate Keep. And at the time, it was, I don't know, I'm not even sure how I got the job. I think I just did some samples, and then I just mailed some photocopies in, and they wrote me a letter and gave me a phone call, and that was that. And I worked on some stuff for them for a couple of years, and that was fun. It's kind of like my introduction to both freelance and fantasy, in a way. Now you see, I'm also using a technical pencil, a Rotring pencil, which I really, really like. The balance is amazing. I highly recommend it if you are a fan of technical pencils. And again, this offers me a layer of detail that I can get at with a finer point. And even that point, I will rub across some paper to make it finer still. So it's almost like a needle. After my work for TSR, I ended up doing some stuff for Shadowrun, which at the time was owned by FASA Incorporated. And then I did some stuff for White Wolf. But most of the work I've done in RPGs was for Shadowrun, I think up until 3rd edition. There might have been a few after that, as the company was, I think, moved out to Washington to become FASA Games or something, or Interactive. And then I think FanPro ended up picking up the Shadowrun license and distributing that. So I might have done a few jobs after the fact. Interesting story about FASA is eventually when I moved out to Seattle, I worked at a game company, and that game company was approached by FASA to create a Shadowrun video game. And I did a bunch of storyboards on how magic would work in the FASA realm. And so I don't know how many boards I did, maybe about 50 or 60 of them. And eventually FASA decided not to go with us, and they developed it in-house. Flash forward, I ended up doing freelance years later on the Shadowrun video game, which, 5 years in the making, 7 years in the making. I did some stuff. They had lost their art director. The whole thing was a complete mess, but I did some freelance, and it's weird how these circles interconnect. What's important to me is when illustrating anything, like horses for all intents and purposes, it's important that the accuracy is as good as I can make it. And not just the technical accuracy. You're trying to get a feel of how a horse moves. And when I was younger, about 5 or so, my dad used to break horses for local ranchers and the like. And so I got to see them in motion a lot, and I actually got to sit on top of them. I fell off of one. That's a whole other story. But even still, I love horses, and I picked up these horses from a store. I think they're made by Schleck, but they were fairly accurate in terms of their shape. I still go through YouTube and pick out good horse videos and try to collect horse images on my Pinterest board, just so I have every angle and every kind of horse, and just to try to imagine how they're feeling and moving in the moment. So like this horse is stopping on a very steep slope of shale. And so I wanted to get that sensation of the hindquarters are drawing down, the front feet are planted firmly, but there's a lot of smoke and dust being kicked up from the sudden stop and the weirdness of the giant. Now maybe I should have had the horse, reeling back in fear, but then it would have been weird because rearing up a horse on a down angle would almost make the horse look like it was level, I think. And so it might sort of not work out as well as I had hoped. honest. I really didn't want to draw a rearing up horse. It looked like it was going to be too hard. I don't know. That's the thing. I don't really shy away from drawing things that are difficult. It's sometimes the limitation of my imagination of like, I didn't think about drawing it harder or drawing something more difficult. It just didn't occur to me. I find by throwing myself into the fire, I'm going to make those mistakes. And the mistakes are the first step in learning on how to overcome them. If you don't take those first steps, if you don't make those first mistakes, you're not going to get better. You just won't. You're going to rely on what you know, and what you know is limited because experience is about what you know. So the more you experience, the more you try, the more you know. So as we close, I'm trying to refine some of the background elements that didn't have a lot of detail, adding shapes to make it balanced and interesting without losing the focus on the main piece. Hey gang, it's worth noting that I also have a Patreon. I cover a lot of stuff about comics and storytelling, as well as storyboarding and running your own freelance business at www.patreon.com/Shane Patrick White. I have 4 different tiers available for you to check out today. If you've ever had the desire to start your own art business, this is the Patreon for you at www.patreon.com/Shane Patrick White. As always, thanks for watching. And also, don't forget to subscribe to The Process. And please, if you have more questions, feel free to leave a comment below.